Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of South Dakota Humanities Council, which produces the Festival of Books. And we would like to acknowledge, first and foremost, that we stand on ground of the Ochede-Shakoween, the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people. We honor and appreciate the Indigenous people who have the longest relationship to this place. Please also help me to thank the Oscar Larson Performing Arts Center for hosting this event, as well as the dozens of volunteers who plan, promote, and staff the festival events. You too can help the festival. First, you can provide us with feedback about this year's event. You can find the link to our online survey at sdbookfestival.com. Second, you can help keep the festival free by making a tax-deductible donation to the South Dakota Humanities Council. To do that, please use the QR code that you'll find at our donation stations and info tables, and it's also available at sdhumanities.org. And we would love this year $50 for our 50-year Humanities Council anniversary. $50 will enter your name into the drawing for the festival guide cover painting by Jennifer White, which is acrylic on canvas titled Buffaloes. The festival would not be possible without the generous support of the numerous organizations and individuals who have already donated and are acknowledged on the back cover of the festival guide, as well as throughout the Oscar Larson Performing Arts Center. Today's program is called Memoir, Meaning, and Masculinity in Little and Often with Trent Preszler. A little about Mr. Preszler. Trent Preszler grew up on a cattle ranch near Faith, South Dakota, and attended a one-room schoolhouse on the Standing Rock Reservation. A 1998 graduate of Iowa State University, he holds an MS in Agricultural Economics and a PhD in Horticulture from Cornell University. Preszler is CEO of Bedell Cellars, a Long Island vineyard, and founder of Preszler Woodshop, where he makes bespoke wooden canoes. His memoir, Little and Often, was a USA Today Best Book of 2021. If everyone would help me give a warm welcome then to Trent Preszler.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Am I up on the screen?
You are.
There we are. Hey guys. Thanks for having me. And I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person. So I have to start with an apology. They say never to start with an apology, but there you go. I wish I could have been there in person, but there's a whole bunch of work stuff that I couldn't move around, so here we are. The next best thing, thank God for Zoom. So I like to do, well, first of all, I love to take questions whenever I do a book signing or a book event, and I'm always fascinated by the questions that I receive because I always learn something. Not just about people, but about their perceptions of my book and my writing, and sometimes people even have different perspectives on my writing that I never even thought of myself. So it's always a joy to do that. You know, when I set out to write this book, I don't think anyone who writes a book really has any idea where it's going to lead. Whether it's going to be a bestseller or critically acclaimed. Like, no one writes a book thinking, I'm going to get rich. Rich and famous from writing a book. You have to write a book for yourself, first and foremost. And even if, it bombs and no one likes it, you have to feel really good about what you did because you did it for yourself. And with Little and Often, it really was very much an act of therapy for me to process grief and loss in my family and the whole insane series of events that led me to build a wooden boat with my dad's tools, having never actually built anything in my life before. So it's been quite a journey, and you guys are actually the last stop on my unofficial book tour. So the hardcover came out in April of 2021, and then the paperback came out in April of 2022. But I'm sort of wrapping up the book tour. I haven't really, I don't have any other book signings planned after this one, so I guess you guys are my farewell stop. But I've also found that writing a memoir, aside from being a way for me to process things that happened in my life, it's also been this constant process of letting go. So you first have to let go of these memories in order to put them down on the page. You have to get them out of your head and onto the page. And then as you refine the story, and certainly the day that it went live, when it was for sale on Amazon and everywhere, April 27th of last year, that's kind of the swallow hard gulp moment, because you're like, wow, okay, this is out there now and I can't take it back. And you have to kind of let it go and let the story live and have its own life with the readers. And sort of every time I do one of these, I'm reminded of that idea that part of the beauty of writing this was being able to let it go and let people experience it themselves. And I've got a folder saved on my computer with a couple thousand letters that I've received, or emails, or Instagram DMs, or texts from people who read the book and said some nice things. That folder is called Good Things People Say. I was really touched by a lot of the things people said, and one of my goals in writing this was to hopefully reach some people whose lives might have been hanging in the balance and might have taken some inspiration from my story. And the best way to do that, I think, is just to kind of tear away all the pretense and just show your true vulnerable self. And there's one story, there's so many that I have in this one folder, but one that sticks out in my mind, I received a message from a guy who owns an auto body repair shop in Tampa, Florida. And he said he had picked up my book because he thought he was going to read a book about woodworking and craft. He said, which it was, but he said it was also much more than that. And he had actually been estranged from his gay son for about 20 years. And as a result of reading my book, he sent his son a copy of the book. His son lived in Miami, and they ended up meeting up and kind of reconciling, basically because of my book. And I wrote him back and I said that was, if nothing else happened from this whole experience, that made it worth it, that was just a wonderful sort of outcome. So I'd love to take questions from the audience. I know that you titled this presentation with the word masculinity in it, and certainly that is one of the themes. And I think, I grew up in Faith, north of Faith, between Faith and Lemon. The nearest town is really this place called Meadow, which I think has a population of maybe 10 or 15 people. And at one point, the family had 10,000 acres of grazing land for cattle. And I went to a one-room schoolhouse that had 8 students. And, at a certain extent, there's, you only know what you see in your exact surroundings growing up then, because there was no internet. So it was like, I almost never saw an image of myself. We didn't have cell phones, we didn't have internet, we barely got any outside news. And so it was kind of like, your perceptions of yourself and masculinity are really based on what's in your surroundings. And my dad was like a roughneck cowboy, cattle rancher. He was a professional rodeo athlete for a certain time of his life. And so that's kind of all I knew growing up. And then sort of as I became a teenager and a little bit more self-aware, and especially when I went off to college, started to realize that I'm different from all of that. So it's interesting when you're so young and you only know one certain thing or one way to see your kind of the layers unfold and peeling back that onion to see really what your true self is, aside from all of that. So anyway, yeah, all I see right now is like part of the screen and a light. So hey, so if there were questions, I would love to take some questions, or and if not, I can just keep rambling here. But I want to make sure I'm giving people what they want.
Can you see me?
Oh, I can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
You need to go up to the microphones.
Still on mute.
I was just going to tell him that we're going to ask the audience to come up to the microphones, so you
Okay.
won't see their faces. I'm going to put our logo back up in place of my face, but you will be able to
Okay.
hear them through the microphones.
Okay, sounds good.
And if no one comes up, then I'm going to get it back
Okay.
to you.
Okay.
Would anyone like to come up and ask me questions?
I could also read part of it if people wanted me to do that.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, hi Trent, thank you so much for being here with us today. I wanted to ask about what it was like writing about the relationship that you had with your father, essentially looking at it from only past experience, right? Because if I'm understanding correctly, you wrote about your relationship with your father after he had already passed, is that correct?
Correct.
So it's
Yeah.
not like you could double check with him and have a conversation with him about writing about this relationship. So I'm so curious what that is like, especially from a memoir, first person perspective, essentially speaking for your father, just what that experience was like and how it was healing and helping for the book.
Yeah, what a great question. I've never been asked that question before. And, it certainly was challenging because I couldn't sort of call him up or say, hey, what do you think about this? And how do you remember that? And in some ways it was like piecing together my childhood as an adult, as he was already gone. And there's two sides of that. One side is that it gave me a chance to reflect on my relationship with him in a way that was more compassionate, because first of all, I knew he couldn't defend himself in any way, and that what was done. And so I either had to learn how to reconcile our relationship somehow as an adult, or basically just live my life being kind of bitter. And the other side of that is this sort of residual just sadness that if there were things that I uncovered in my interrogation of my memory and my feelings that I wanted to apologize for, or that I felt needed reconciliation, it's kind of like you just have this quiet understanding that, oh yeah, I wish I had done that differently, but it's too late now. And you can't sort of make that right. And so I guess, writing the book is sort of a step-by-step process of trying to make things right in my own head, right in a way that I could move forward and live in peace and feel like I had respected our relationship, respected him, while also kind of just being really truthful about, how things unfolded. When I first sold this book to HarperCollins, I had written a proposal and my agent had shopped it around, and actually he sent it out at like 9 a.m. on a Thursday, and by noon that day, so just like 3 hours later, he had an email from the executive editor of HarperCollins who said, I have to meet Trent and I want to meet him right away. And so like the very next morning, I went into the HarperCollins headquarters downtown in Manhattan, and I walked in, and the editor, who ended up being my editor, said, you and I have nothing in common. He He grew up in Queens. He runs HarperCollins. He'd never been to South Dakota. He's married with kids. He said, but I read your proposal and I almost cried over my salad at lunch because I couldn't believe that I felt such commonality between you and your relationship with your dad and me and my relationship with my dad. And he said, his dad was like an auto repair mechanic in Queens, and he never really felt like maybe he respected him as being a book editor. And he said, it's a universal thing. He said, your story is so specific, right? Like you built a canoe and you're from South Dakota and you grew up on a ranch. But even though it's specific, it has a universal kind of appeal in that he believed most people, men especially, but most people at some point struggle for and aspire to having the approval of their father. So that began the journey of kind of doing this. And just another point to your question, I love your question. Another point is that sometimes people say, well, thank you for sharing, the story of you and your father. And, I'll be gracious to say, well, you're welcome, but it's so much more than that. It's not just like sharing a story between me and Dad, as you mentioned. It's really an interrogation of my own memory and my own memories of my father, and kind of finding that one thread, like, if you've ever had a piece of clothing that frayed and you pull out one thread and then you keep pulling it and then you end up with like a run in the fabric. That's really what writing this memoir was like. So every time I thought of a story that related to my father, I had to kind of check with my editor, did that fit into the thread, the story that we were trying to tell? And so there's a lot of memories of Dad that aren't even in the book. And everyone has their own perspective on memory as well. And you can guarantee that anyone who writes a memoir could probably interview someone in their family or someone who's in the memoir and get a totally different take on the story, because all of us operate in life based on our own perspective. And there's that book, The Four Tenets, written by, and I forget his name, Miguel Ruiz. I think it sold like 20 million copies or something. One of the tenets of a happy life was to remember that nothing's actually about you, and that people live their whole life in their own head and in their own life and in their own experience. And often, if you let go of that thought that everything everyone does is because of you, and you realize that everything people do is because of themselves and their own experience, you can kind of let go of a lot of your angst about the world. And that was, I think, a big learning point for me with Dad. Just knowing that for as much as I felt like maybe I was a victim of him as a kid, that I could see now as an adult how he was just living his life, and he was responding the best way he knew how in those circumstances, which had almost nothing to do with me and were really kind of beyond the scope of my control or my ability to even grasp. I mean, his ranch was going bankrupt. He had a daughter who was severely disabled, and then he got cancer from Agent Orange exposure in Vietnam. So yeah, if he lost his patience with me, it probably wasn't necessarily because of me, although I certainly did do some things that were worthy of his angst as well. But anyway, thanks for that question, and let me know if I didn't answer it fully. You can follow up with another one too.
Would anyone else like to ask any questions? Or would you like to hear Trent do some reading from Little and Often? Okay. The audience is indicating that some reading from Little and Often would be to their liking.
Okay. I always love story time, and it's funny. One time I did a book signing in Wisconsin, in this little town in northern Wisconsin, right on Lake Superior, called Bayfield, and at a bookstore called Honest Dog Books, which you should all check out. It's owned by a very dear friend of mine. And they were our #1 seller of my book. It was her top seller for last year. And I did this book signing, and I always read something from the book, and sometimes I'll take requests if someone wants, or I'll just read something that I want to read. And someone there had requested that I read the scene about where my dad shot and killed the bull on the ranch. And I was like, okay, wow, well, I've never read this one out loud before. And, it was really intense. And I said, wow, I'm never going to read that aloud again. And if you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. There was a rather gory scene. And just a note on that scene, my editor wanted to cut that chapter at one point because he felt like it was too gory because my dad had killed this bull and the bull was in the act of breeding a cow. And I said, it was the only time I really pushed back, and I said, if you cut this out, then this book is just going to be like cowboy, pantomime, greenwashing, where it's just, sort of what a New York City person thinks a cowboy life is like. I said, this is the real. This is the real stuff that happens that every farm kid in South Dakota knows happens, but maybe hadn't been put into writing before. And it was really gratifying when we sent the book out to get blurbs. So you probably know about this process, but once you finish a book, the editor, the publisher sends it around to celebrities and other authors to see if they'll read it and, give you a quote for the front or the back cover. And the front cover has a quote from Elizabeth Gilbert, who you might not have heard of, and she wrote Eat, Pray, Love, and I can't even believe still that she read it and provided a blurb. But one of the bits of feedback she gave was that she was haunted for days by the part where my dad shot the bull. And that to her was so compelling and unforgettable and powerful. So anyway, I'm not going to read the bull killing scene, but I might read, and I don't normally do this because I don't want to give away the ending, but since this is my last stop on the book tour, I may as well. We kind of knew when I started writing this book, I knew with my editor, we wanted the book to end with me on the ocean paddling the canoe. So it was kind of, we wanted it to sort of all build up to that moment because that was really the moment when I realized the purpose of my whole journey. So it ended up being a book basically chronicling the year after my father died, of me building a canoe. And we always sort of had this cinematic image of the ending being, it was a snowy, blizzardy, kind of blustery day on the water, and then I was paddling the canoe, and the camera kind of pans out from above. And there was this magical moment where I paddled the canoe. It was a calm day. It wasn't super windy, but it was one of those calm days where the snow flurries just come down in these perfect little crystals. And I paddled the canoe that I built with my dad's tools. So I'm going to read from the ending where I'm paddling the canoe. I don't know how much time we have. It's the last couple, 2 pages maybe. Let's see. All right. A world that might allow such a life of boat building and woodworking, which had tormented me for the last year, had now opened its doors and welcomed me inside. The canoe spoke to me of that world. It said, "You belong here. Whomever you made yourself into, that's who you always were." I'm just going to skip ahead 1 second. Okay. Under a somber gray sky with swirling clouds, I walked the canoe into a foot of icy water, soaking my work boots. I grabbed both gunnels and hopped in. The canoe wobbled back and forth while I gained my balance. The simple act of sitting in it made my chest burst with pride. I plunged my paddle into the water and twisted my body to pull it behind me. 3 hard strokes, and the canoe moved away from shore, gliding soundlessly over submerged jetties. I tracked east along the eddy line and seawater slapped against the hull, sending up icy spray that stung my eyes. Just outside the cut to Marituka Point, the tide ran out in slow brown coils that were laced with oak leaves and the occasional whiteness of a split tree branch bobbing under the surface. The salt marsh and seagrass bed spread out behind the beach like a low table, having been scrubbed clean by wind and waves. I gulped draughts of cold air and let my eyes go out of focus, watching the scene ahead of me turn into a soft blur of colors: the dark wintergreen spartina, the lead-colored water, and the rusted mahogany brilliance of my canoe. I had paddled only a few yards into the deep channel when a light but cutting northeast wind ruffled the water. The paddling got a little harder. I moved the canoe slowly and erratically across the channel into the wide expanse of Peconic Bay. In the swirling currents, there was a constant renewal, a perpetual mixing, half seawater flowing west from the Atlantic, half bay water flowing east from inland tributaries. The waves at the Peconic were not huge, but were steep and sharp-crested, and the wind tore off them at the top, leaving my paddle blade flailing at air one moment and sunk too deep the next. Frothy waves splashed over the deck and into the canoe. I was blown sideways, fighting the current, spray flying from the paddle with every release. The bow rose, bucking up the trough of one wave, shedding a string of water off the deck in droplets. When the bow fell, the gray sky enveloped the crest of another wave. I saw in action the design of the canoe's tension spring and all its parts supporting one another. The hull, held taut by the gunwales, straddled the waves with air underneath. I kept paddling, first this stroke, then the next, until a curtain opened ahead of me. The infinite shades of blue on the sea were transformed when the sun broke through the clouds and unfurled a translucent ray of golden light. With Robins Island in sight now, I paddled in long, precise strokes, setting a rhythm for myself, whipping the blade behind me and plunging it back down in front. I found my swing and surged through the waves. The beat went up a notch, and then another. I counted down the strokes, starting at 10, like I was bearing down in some imaginary finish line. The varnished hull was sleek and lithe, thrusting forward between my strokes like a galloping horse. God had told Job of his horse, he devours the distance with fierceness. Yes, God, he did. My canoe moved with such strength and grace that I couldn't believe I had ever known a troubled moment building it. When I emerged from the chute on the sheltered leeward side of Robins Island, the environment underwent an abrupt change. I paddled into a cove and glided onto a glassy swell so wide it seemed to be a pond. A bald eagle perched on the limb of an oak tree jutting up from a cliff that was creased with seams of water flowing down its face like tears. The canoe reflected a violet colors that dipped and caught the late afternoon light. I nosed alongside the Robins Island dock, and there, at last, I tethered the canoe to the dock with Dad's rope. I had arrived. I did it. I felt like I'd cry, though I didn't. I only smiled. It seemed like such a little thing and such a big thing at once, like a secret I would tell myself the rest of my life, though I didn't understand the meaning of it all yet. I sat there for several minutes, taking everything in, listening to the creaks and sighs of tiny ripples lapping against the hull. The cove near the dock was ringed by driftwood and boulders the size of cars, the disordered, rocky remains of the Laurentide ice sheet. The North Fork was once a glacial wasteland, and it was a wonder of the world that life had survived and evolved here in the old wreck and spill of rocks. But those rocks were also telling me something that I had paddled all this way to learn. The spinning of the earth had sent water east to west, sliding up sounds and bays, ebbing and flowing like clockwork, bringing in good and carrying out bad, little and often. Now there was only the silence and stillness of the water, what the rocks turned into after healing. I reclined on the stern and trailed both my hands over the gunwales, letting my fingertips dip into the water. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes against the sun. Thank you, Dad, I said over and over again. Thank you, not just for the toolbox, but also for everything I could feel gathering up inside me, for everything that building this canoe had taught me, and everything I couldn't yet know that was already seared into my soul like a branding iron sears cattle hides. So much was unknown to me, but I didn't have to know everything. It was enough to trust that what I did mattered, that I understood the canoe's meaning without yet being able to say precisely how. I could trust my hands knowing they built this canoe, and it was enough. It was my own sacred and mysterious life manifested in a colorful floating quilt made of wood. As I untethered Dad's rope from the dock and coiled it around my arm, I felt his presence there with me. He would always be with me no matter what, embodied in the tools and the wood of this canoe. Through his death, Dad gave me a new life. He did. It was true. I could now rightfully call myself a craftsman and a boat builder who lived in communion with nature. My canoe was my freedom. And with that understanding, some inexplicable pain deep inside me evaporated. In its place, I felt a flood of gratitude. I felt whole. I was my own man now, all of me, and I was ready to paddle home. That night, I dried off the canoe as it rested on the floor of my living room. As much as I had wanted it, and as much as I understood what it meant to me, the canoe wasn't the most important thing I would take away from the experience. Immediately after the maiden voyage, even as I dragged the canoe onto the beach and opened the patio doors to let my dog Caper run free, an expansive sense of calm had enveloped me. On the paddle home from Robbins Island, I had thought about Mom and Dad, and all the people who have ever loved family heirlooms, looked out for them, sought them when they were lost, and tried to preserve them so they could be passed down to the next generation. And there had come a singular moment paddling home when I realized with startling clarity the meaning of my year as a boat builder. It unfolded inside me like a secret waiting to be told. Dad's lesson was not specifically about scraping paint off bricks or growing grapes or building boats. It was much more than that. It had everything to do with life itself. I had started this journey believing that no matter how long I lived, Dad wouldn't have been able to give me the all-encompassing love that I craved. Maybe he was banking on that when he understood that he was going to die, because when the moment came for him to say goodbye, he didn't hold back a single ounce of his love. He gave me the biggest gift of all. It was a lot more than a banged-up toolbox and a taxidermy duck. It was everything he had. Just as every wood shaving is a unique imprint of a tree's growth rings and the blade that cut it, so too had I been shaped and forged by a lifetime of little gestures that added up to something bigger. There were the days I had spent with Dad in his shop, or riding horses, or duck hunting, or tooling around country roads in Old Yeller, not speaking more than 10 words to each other. There were the years Mom answered my phone calls at her desk just to show up for me and to listen. There were the moments I held Lucy's frail hands and stared into her eyes, knowing she couldn't utter a word back to me, but knowing she loved me nonetheless. Theirs was a silent kind of love that ran deep and did not grow old, even in a culture that said otherwise. It was a love shown in actions, not words. I took the long way home to find myself, and when I arrived, I learned that there was a greater love at the heart of parenting and of being a good son. It was a love cultivated slowly as time marched on, a growing rather than diminishing acceptance of each other. While it was true that I had built a boat, Dad had been working on his own project, something much bigger and more complicated than a canoe, something that took much longer than a year to complete. I am the man my dad made, little and often. That's the ending. Yeah. I spoiled the ending. I'm sorry for anyone who hasn't read the book yet, but if you do read it, that can be your goal. That I'm so proud of those last 2 pages. That was like the last 2.5 to 3 pages, and it took a long time to get that right. A lot of editing, and it's hard for me to even read it without, choking up and crying. There's a great audio book that we put out, and the narrator is an actor named Matt Bomer, and I wanted like a professional voice actor to read it. No one really likes the sound of their own voice, and I also wanted to hear how someone else would emphasize maybe different things in the reading of my book. but Matt lives in LA, and so we had the sound studio in West Hollywood during the middle of COVID. And he finished the recording probably in, I think it was about 5 days, 5 really long, hard days. But we had to re-record the ending, like those last 3 pages. We had to record them so many times because Matt couldn't stop crying. He would get to a certain place and then he would choke up, and it would happen every single time. So he had to take some breaks and gather himself. And I can still hear in the actual recording, there's the one place where his voice kind of cracks, but he holds it together enough to finish the book. So anyway.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing. We have
Yeah.
a little bit of time left. If anyone in the audience would like to journey up to a microphone, any more questions or comments? All right. Trent, nobody's volunteering a question at the
Okay.
microphone. Would you like to leave us with any parting or
Yeah.
starting thoughts?
Well, there's a great movie called Ratatouille, which you've probably seen. It's an animated film, came out a few years ago. And there's one scene at the end of that where Anton Ego, the famous restaurant critic, says, because he tastes food made by a rat for a chef, right? And he loved the food so much, and he said it was proof that maybe not everyone can be a great artist, but a great artist can truly come from anywhere. And that line really stuck with me, and I hope anyone that is listening, or anyone that grew up in South Dakota, I always felt limited because I was from South Dakota for some reason, and now I feel like it's the thing I'm most proud of. So anyone can come from anywhere and do great things, and I have a real soft spot in my heart, obviously, for the state of South Dakota. So I'm honored to be part of this Festival of Books. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Trent. A round of applause. Alrighty. Well, I agree. I like that Ratatouille quote, 100%. Thank you for being with us today. Even if it was not in person, we still felt like we were in the same room, listening to passages from Little and Often. Thanks for being part of the Festival of Books.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks so much for having me. Take care.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.